Can I come back to the plant-based vegan diet? Is it possible to get all the nutrients you need for optimal health for the average punter?
No.
What are the big things that you miss by being on a vegan diet?
Well, the one that everybody knows about is vitamin B12.
Which you can't get unless you're having animal
protein.
protein.
You cannot get unless you're having animal foods. Now, there's some people that talk about bacterial production way down in the colon and all of this, and that's basically garbage. Even if there were bacteria down inside your colon that could be producing B12, that's not where it's absorbed in the intestines. So you're basically going to excrete it. So you cannot have, by definition, a nutritionally complete vegan diet without supplementation. Now, vegetarian diet...
Supplementation in the form of oral or intravenous supplements?
It's either got to be, oral B12 or injectable B12. Now, on a vegetarian diet, because you are permitted some animal foods, then you do get higher amount. You can get some of these. But the vegan diet is absolutely impossible to be optimally healthy without extraneous supplementation. Then we come to other nutrients which we know, things like zinc and iron and copper, which are far higher concentration in animal foods than they are in plant foods. And it's not just the concentration of these nutrients that we need to be aware of, but also their form. For instance, the type of iron, so you've got heme and non-heme iron. The type of iron that you get in plant foods is very difficult for the body to absorb and to know what to do with compared to the iron that we have in meat. And that goes for, as I alluded to before with the omega-3s. The type of omega-3 that we get from plants is very hard for the body to know what to do with. Whereas what we call the marine omega-3, basically to reflect that it's a good quality DHA, the body's very easily able to assimilate that into its tissues. Then we also have a factor called antinutrients. And this sounds a little bit sci-fi.
Antinutrients.
But we've all heard about it. So there's a reason your doctor tells you not to drink tea when you have an iron supplement. If you're a vegetarian low in iron, the reason is because there's substances in the tea, like tannins and phytates, that will actually interfere with the absorption of the nutrients. So, for instance, we've done some studies looking at zinc absorption, and if you have a zinc-rich food, like oysters, and have some black beans at the same time, you will reduce your absorption of that zinc by more than 50%. So, in effect, you're getting less than half of what you otherwise would have if you didn't have that food with the beans at the same time, because of these anti-nutrient factors within the beans. So it becomes very, very difficult. So we all get hooked up on these recommended daily intakes and things like that. And really, they've been created with very poor science, and it doesn't necessarily reflect whether or not the micronutrient you're looking at is the most bioavailable form, and it certainly doesn't take into account what you're consuming it with. That concurrent consumption of these anti-nutrient substances will then impair the end nutrient result that you're getting from that. And that's not even including the deleterious effect that certain substances in plants, such as lectins or glutens, these other type of proteins, that they actually are known to cause harm to us, to humans. So there's a lot of moving parts.
There is, but it's, and I don't think there's ever been a point in time in the history of man where more people are convinced that the best thing for their own health and the health of the planet is a plant-based diet. And I can only assume it's because the plant-based movement and the climate change movement that quite often has hidden agendas and quite often has big corporations behind it have just been very good at spreading their message. Propaganda is probably a word I'd prefer to use, but let's call it spreading their message. How can we get the science so wrong? And I do want to talk about the other side of the ledger in a minute. And maybe we're starting to have more influences on the omnivore, carnivore side of it. But in your view, why do you think that so many people are misguided in believing that they're doing the right thing for themselves and the planet by eating a plant-based diet?
I think it's a simple and an instinctive message. I also happen to think it's wrong. There's a couple of very appealing things. So we know that this whole business about the saturated fats in the diet being bad for us is just complete bunkum. But the logical extension of that, if you accept that premise, is that because plant foods are very low in saturated fats, plant foods ergo must be good for us. So we can make these type of leaps of faith. And there are studies out there that do appear to demonstrate that the plant-based diets are good for us, understanding that they've set a very low bar of comparing themselves to junk food rich, carbohydrate rich, processed food rich diets.
Yeah.
So I mean, basically you could go out and have a bowl of mud. That's going to beat the Australian diet.
Yeah.
The average Australian diet. Then it comes this ethical issue as well, and instinctively that is appealing for especially a lot of young people, and I can understand the appeal there. But I think there's also a lack of understanding that a true vegan diet does not exist without dead animals.
This is a conversation that I've had a couple of times with some really learned people around the fact that so many more animals are killed by plant-based agriculture than by animal-based agriculture, and we used an example recently. We had Joel Salatin, that amazing sustainable farmer, on the podcast a few weeks ago, around a farmer here in Australia that raises animals and raises crops and has done the study on how many animals die and the length and pain of their death through plant-based agriculture versus an animal that's part of the food chain and is raised and treated and has one bad nanosecond in its life. But again, it's a conversation that gets caught up in romantic views of Disney characters and that a cow's more valuable than a field mice or a bird or whatever it happens to be.
Well, let's look at it like this. So we know that plants come from soil, and they draw all their nutrition and their sustenance from the soil in which they've grown. And yet, if we don't fertilise the soil, then if you don't feed the soil, you won't grow anything. We know this. The soil will be depleted. Now, after World War II, when we had this boom in agriculture, this discovery of fossil fuels and how we could use the fossil fuels to make fertiliser, and we were growing. Now think for a second, fossil fuel, dead animals.
Yeah.
We basically require, without death, there is no life.
Yep, agree fully.
Without biological matter that comes from things that have previously been in existence, our soil is barren. So in essence, there is no such thing as a vegan diet. And if you think there is, you are kidding yourself. And then it comes to the environmental effects. Every time you take a plough to a soil, you turn it over, you expose trillions of microbes to the elements, to the UV radiation of the sun. They get blown away. Every season that you plough a field, you deplete the topsoil. And it's been estimated that by 2020, we'll have depleted 50% of the topsoil that we've ever had.
By next year?
Effectively, yes.
Yeah.
So, sure, we've still got a lot of topsoil to go, but what happens when that runs out? Now, so growing crops depletes this. Do you know what replenishes topsoil? Grazing ruminant animals.
Yeah.
Because they've got this remarkable ability. So grass, from the cellulose in grass, is basically produced through this remarkable process using the sun rays, photosynthesis.
Yeah.
And then these cows, they can come and they can basically ferment that in their guts, and they'll have excrement that comes out the other end, and that will actually build topsoil. So whereas if you crop a land, you deplete the topsoil. If you graze a land with ruminants, you'll replenish that soil.
Particularly if it's rotational.
And people will also talk about the water use. It's almost like if a cow drinks some water that it doesn't come out the other end. It's not wastewater. The cow is actually watering the fields for you via the urine. So these whole arguments, the zero-sum game about, cattle do this and they do that, they've actually been shown to lead to a sequestration of carbon. They're actually, if you actually have a look at it and how much carbon actually gets sequestered in the soil from grazing, the running cattle is actually beneficial from a carbon balance perspective.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter which way you look at it. I mean, they're very appealing vegan arguments, but they're very easily dispatched. If you have a look at from an ethical perspective, then you can understand that, it's not, you don't have life without death, and it's just, you've got to be an adult, grow up and admit that there's no other way for you to thrive. It is impossible for you as a human to exist without there being death on some level.
Yeah.
If you have a look at it from an environmental perspective, we've just had the wool pulled over our eyes. If you have a look at it from a nutritional perspective, again, we've been misled.
Yeah.
So whichever way you look at it, I don't believe that a vegan diet stacks up.